Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Patrick Hardy had built his life on three pillars: family, loyalty, and strength. At 42, he commanded respect in every room he entered. His construction company, Hardy Foundations, had grown from a one-man operation to a multi-million-dollar empire spanning 3 states. But Patrick's greatest pride wasn't his business. It was his family. 20 years of marriage to Chris Hardy had given him what he thought was everything a man could want. She was beautiful, charming, and the mother of his 18-year-old daughter, Amy. Patrick had met Chris when she was just 19, a small-town girl from Oregon whose father, Russell Bush, ran a failing auto repair shop. Patrick had swept her off her feet, married her within a year, and moved her to his growing empire in Colorado. Patrick's philosophy was simple. Those who earned his trust received his unwavering loyalty, but those who betrayed it faced consequences that would haunt them forever. He'd learned this lesson early from his own father, a steel worker who taught him that a man's word was his bond and his family was his fortress. Chris had always seemed to understand this about her husband. She played the perfect wife role, attending charity galas, hosting dinner parties for his business associates, and maintaining their pristine image in Denver social circles. Amy, their daughter, had inherited Patrick's strong will and Chris's beauty. She was set to start college in the fall, planning to study business to eventually join Hardy Foundations. But beneath the surface of this perfect family portrait, cracks had been forming for months. Patrick had noticed small changes in Chris: secretive phone calls, unexplained absences, new clothes that didn't appear on their credit card statements. His instincts, honed by years of reading people and business deals, told him something was wrong. However, he dismissed these feelings, telling himself that 20 years of marriage had earned Chris the benefit of the doubt. The irony wasn't lost on Patrick that he could read the intentions of corrupt contractors and scheming competitors like an open book, yet he'd chosen to ignore the signs in his own home. Perhaps it was love, or perhaps it was the arrogance of a man who believed his fortress was impenetrable. Trevor Garrison had entered their lives 6 months ago as Chris's new personal trainer. At 35, Trevor possessed the kind of rugged charm that made women forget their vows and men question their own masculinity. He'd moved to Denver from California, claiming he wanted a fresh start after a messy divorce. Patrick had even liked the man initially. Trevor was articulate, seemed professional, and had impressive credentials. What Patrick didn't know was that Trevor specialized in more than fitness training. He was a predator who targeted wealthy, neglected wives, seducing them with attention their husbands were too busy to provide. Trevor had researched the Hardy family extensively before taking the job, knowing exactly what kind of goldmine he'd discovered in Chris. The affair had begun innocently enough: extended training sessions, intimate conversations about Chris's unfulfilled dreams, and gradually escalating physical contact. Trevor was a master manipulator who knew exactly how to make a woman feel desired and understood. He'd convinced Chris that her husband took her for granted, that she deserved passion and excitement. For Chris, the affair represented everything missing from her marriage. Patrick's success had made him increasingly absent, focused on expanding his empire, while she felt like a beautiful decoration in their mansion. Trevor offered her adventure, spontaneity, and the intoxicating feeling of being wanted for more than just her ability to play the perfect wife. Amy, caught between her parents' growing distance, had begun acting out. Her grades suffered, she'd started drinking at parties, and she'd recently been arrested for reckless driving, an incident Patrick had quietly made disappear with a few phone calls. He'd attributed her behavior to typical teenage rebellion, never imagining the chaos brewing beneath his roof. The family's carefully constructed facade was maintained through years of practice. Sunday dinners, family vacations, public appearances, all performed with the precision of seasoned actors. Patrick threw himself deeper into work. Chris lost herself in her secret affair, and Amy spiraled into increasingly dangerous behavior as she sensed the impending explosion. Russell Bush, Chris's father, had been battling cancer for the past year. The old man had never particularly liked Patrick, seeing him as the city slicker who'd stolen his daughter away from small-town Oregon. But Russell was proud, too proud to accept charity from his wealthy son-in-law, even as medical bills mounted and his auto shop struggled to stay afloat. When Russell's condition worsened 2 weeks ago, Patrick had insisted on personally caring for him, seeing it as his duty as a son-in-law. He'd moved into Russell's small house in Bend, Oregon, sleeping on a lumpy couch and helping the stubborn old man through his final days. It was a gesture that Chris had praised publicly, while secretly celebrating the freedom it gave her to intensify her affair with Trevor. During those 2 weeks, Patrick had gained a new perspective on his life. Watching Russell fight his losing battle with dignity and grace made Patrick reflect on what truly mattered. He decided to return home early, planning to surprise Chris and Amy with a renewed commitment to putting family first. He'd even stopped at a jewelry store in Denver, purchasing an expensive necklace for Chris as a symbol of his desire to reconnect. The construction king who could build anything had failed to notice that his own foundation was crumbling. As Patrick drove through Denver's affluent neighborhoods toward his mansion, he felt optimistic about the future. He had no idea that he was about to discover a betrayal so profound it would unleash a darkness within him that even he didn't know existed. The pieces were in place for a collision that would destroy lives and reveal the true nature of everyone involved. Patrick Hardy, the man who never forgave betrayal, was about to face the ultimate test of that principle from the people he loved most. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. The 2 weeks Patrick spent caring for Russell Bush were transformative in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The old man, despite his illness, possessed a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. During long nights when pain kept Russell awake, he'd regaled Patrick with stories of his younger days, his dreams, and his disappointments. "You know what your problem is, Patrick?" Russell had said during one of their late-night conversations, his voice weakened by chemotherapy, but his eyes still piercing. "You think providing for someone is the same as loving them. Your wife doesn't need another diamond bracelet. She needs a husband who sees her as more than a trophy." Patrick had dismissed the comment at the time, attributing it to Russell's pain medication and general dislike of him. But the words lingered, especially when Russell continued his brutal honesty. "Chris was never meant for this city life you've given her. She was a wild girl, full of dreams and passion. You've turned her into a museum piece, beautiful to look at but not allowed to be touched or moved." The irony was that while Patrick received this unwanted wisdom about his marriage, Chris was 300 miles away, living out the very passion Russell described, just not with her husband. In Denver, Chris had grown bolder during Patrick's absence. Trevor no longer limited their encounters to hotel rooms and gym sessions. He'd been staying at the Hardy Mansion, sleeping in the guest room officially, but spending his nights in the master bedroom. They'd grown careless, leaving evidence of their affairs scattered throughout the house like breadcrumbs waiting to be discovered. Amy had initially been appalled by her mother's behavior. She'd confronted Chris during the first week of Patrick's absence, threatening to call her father and expose the affair. But Chris had manipulated her daughter with devastating effectiveness. "Your father doesn't love me anymore, Amy," Chris had wept, playing the victim with Academy Award-worthy performance. "He's married to his business, not to me. Trevor makes me feel alive again. Don't you want your mother to be happy?" The manipulation had worked partially because Amy was already struggling with her own issues. Her recent arrest had left her feeling guilty and rebellious simultaneously. Her relationship with Patrick had grown strained as she'd begun to see him as an authoritarian figure more than a loving father. When Chris painted Patrick as the neglectful husband, it resonated with Amy's own feelings of being overlooked in favor of business priorities. But the final nail in Amy's resistance came when Trevor turned his manipulative charm on her. He convinced Amy that she was mature beyond her years, that she understood adult complexities her father couldn't grasp. He'd filled her head with poison about Patrick being controlling and old-fashioned, while positioning himself as the cool, understanding figure who truly got both mother and daughter. "Your mom deserves happiness, Amy," Trevor had said during one of their conversations by the pool. And you deserve parents who are truly in love, not just going through the motions. Sometimes people need to make difficult choices to find their authentic selves. Trevor's greatest talent wasn't seduction. It was psychological manipulation. He'd identified each family member's weaknesses and exploited them masterfully. With Chris, he'd targeted her feelings of neglect and desire for excitement. With Amy, he'd appealed to her teenage rebellion and need to feel sophisticated. As the days passed, the affair intensified beyond physical betrayal. Chris began sharing intimate details about Patrick's business, his weaknesses, his fears. She revealed his bank account information, his business strategies, even his passwords. Love affairs often involve emotional spillage, but this went far beyond pillow talk. Chris was essentially handing Trevor a roadmap to her husband's destruction. Trevor, for his part, was already planning his next moves. He convinced Chris that they should be together permanently, but he needed to ensure he wouldn't lose access to the hearty fortune in the process. He'd begun researching divorce laws, Patrick's business vulnerabilities, and ways to maximize Chris's settlement. His endgame wasn't just stealing another man's wife. It was destroying the man entirely and taking everything he'd built. The transformation in both women was remarkable. Chris, who'd been the picture of elegant restraint for 20 years, became wild and reckless. She'd started drinking heavily, making impulsive purchases, and treating the household staff with increasing disdain. The mask of perfection she'd worn for 2 decades was finally cracking, revealing someone Patrick had never truly known. Amy's changes were equally dramatic. She'd gone from being Daddy's little girl to actively participating in the deception against him. She'd learned to lie convincingly, to cover for her mother's absences, and to redirect her father's questions during their phone calls. The guilt of betraying Patrick warred with her anger toward him, creating a volatile emotional cocktail that made her increasingly unpredictable. The mansion itself began to reflect the moral decay occurring within its walls. Rooms that had always been meticulously maintained showed signs of neglect. The housekeeper, Maria, had been dismissed suddenly by Chris, who claimed they needed privacy during this difficult time with Russell's illness. In reality, Chris couldn't risk having witnesses to the affair. Trevor had also begun establishing himself as more than just a guest. He'd moved personal items into the house, started answering the phone when Patrick called, and even began making suggestions about redecorating. His audacity was breathtaking, but it served a purpose. He was psychologically claiming territory, making himself indispensable to Chris while simultaneously erasing Patrick's presence from his own home. The neighborhood began to notice changes too. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman next door, observed strange cars coming and going at odd hours. She'd seen Chris and Trevor together in compromising situations in the backyard, though she'd initially assumed Trevor was just a very friendly trainer. The postman noticed that mail was piling up, that the usually pristine landscaping was becoming overgrown. Meanwhile, in Oregon, Patrick was experiencing his own transformation. Caring for Russell had reconnected him with his own mortality and values. He'd spent hours reflecting on his marriage, his relationship with Amy, and his priorities. He'd made mental plans to scale back his business involvement, to take Chris on a second honeymoon, to be more present for Amy's final year before college. Russell's death came on a Tuesday morning, peaceful but still devastating. Despite their complicated relationship, Patrick had grown to respect the old man's honest perspective on life. As he arranged the funeral and settled Russell's affairs, Patrick felt a sense of duty fulfilled and looked forward to returning home to begin rebuilding his family relationships. The final irony was that as Patrick drove home with renewed hope for his marriage, Chris was in their bedroom with Trevor, planning how to ask for a divorce. She convinced herself that she'd fallen truly in love for the first time in her life, and that Patrick would eventually understand. In her selfishness, she'd completely underestimated the man she'd lived with for 20 years. Patrick Hardy was about to come home to a house that was no longer his, to a family that had already betrayed him, and to a life that had been systematically dismantled in his absence. The foundation he'd spent decades building was about to collapse, and the man who emerged from the rubble would be someone none of them recognized. Chapter 3. The Moment of Truth. Patrick's Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway of his mansion at 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday night. He'd driven straight through from Oregon, fueled by grief for Russell and anticipation of reuniting with his family. The house was ablaze with lights, which surprised him since Chris usually preferred dimmer lighting in the evenings. Several cars were parked in the driveway, vehicles he didn't recognize. His first thought was that Chris might be hosting one of her charity committee meetings, though he couldn't remember any events scheduled for tonight. Patrick grabbed his overnight bag and the jewelry box containing Chris's surprise necklace, walking toward the front door with tired but hopeful steps. The front door was unlocked, which immediately set off alarm bells in Patrick's mind. Despite living in an affluent neighborhood, he'd always insisted on proper security protocols. As he stepped into the foyer, he could hear music and laughter coming from the back of the house, sounds of celebration that seemed inappropriate given Russell's recent death. Patrick set down his bags and followed the noise through his own home, feeling increasingly like an intruder. The living room showed signs of recent partying: empty wine bottles, scattered clothing, cushions thrown carelessly on the floor. His home, usually maintained to museum standards, looked like a fraternity house after a weekend bender. As he approached the sliding glass doors leading to the pool area, Patrick could see figures in the water and around the deck. What he witnessed next would be burned into his memory forever. Chris was in the pool with Trevor, locked in a passionate embrace that left no doubt about their relationship. Amy sat at the pool's edge, drinking wine and laughing as she watched her mother betray her father. But it wasn't just the physical affair that shattered Patrick. It was the complete transformation of his family. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a recent development. The ease with which they interacted, the comfort level, the way Amy participated in the celebration. This had been going on for months, possibly longer. Patrick stood frozen behind the glass door, watching his world collapse in real time. 20 years of marriage, 18 years of fatherhood, a lifetime of trust and love, all revealed to be an elaborate deception. But what cut deepest was Amy's laughter. His little girl, whom he'd protected and provided for, was celebrating his betrayal. Trevor noticed Patrick first. Instead of showing shame or fear, he smiled and waved, as if greeting an old friend. The audacity was breathtaking. Chris followed Trevor's gaze and saw her husband standing in the doorway. For a moment, her face showed genuine shock and fear. But then something shifted in her expression. Defiance replaced shame. "Patrick," she called out, not bothering to separate from Trevor. "You're early." Amy's reaction was the most devastating. When she saw her father, her laughter died, but her eyes showed no remorse, only irritation at being caught. The daughter who'd once been his greatest joy now looked at him like he was an unwelcome intruder in his own home. Patrick slid open the door and stepped onto the deck. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence. 3 pairs of eyes watched him, calculating his next move. But Patrick had perfected the art of emotional control in countless business negotiations. His face remained impassive as he surveyed the scene. "Trevor," Patrick said calmly, his voice carrying none of the rage burning inside him. "I trust you've been taking good care of my family." Trevor, emboldened by what he mistook for Patrick's weakness, actually laughed. "Better than you have, apparently." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Patrick had faced down union bosses, corrupt politicians, and ruthless competitors, but none of those confrontations had prepared him for this moment. His family, the people he'd built his entire life around, had not just betrayed him, but were now openly mocking him. Chris finally found her voice. "Patrick, we need to talk. Things have changed while you were gone." "Have they?" Patrick asked, his tone still eerily calm. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what looked like emails, though he was actually buying time to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Amy, perhaps sensing the tension, tried to defuse the situation with teenage logic. "Dad, you can't be that surprised. You never hear anyway. Mom deserves to be happy." The words hit Patrick like physical blows. His own daughter, defending her mother's affair, reducing 20 years of sacrifice and love to a simple matter of presence versus absence. But what Amy didn't understand was that she'd just sealed her own fate in Patrick's mind. Betrayal was one thing, but defending the betrayal was unforgivable. "I see," Patrick said quietly. He looked at each of them in turn, his wife, his daughter, the man who'd invaded his home and destroyed his family. "Russell died this morning. I thought you should know." The announcement created a moment of awkward silence. Chris's face showed a flicker of genuine emotion. Her father was dead, and she'd been celebrating with her lover instead of mourning. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by defensive anger. "You could have called," she said, though they all knew Patrick had tried calling multiple times over the past few days, only to be sent a voicemail or given brief, dismissive conversations. "I wanted to tell you in person," Patrick replied. "I wanted to come home to my family." The emphasis on my family was subtle but unmistakable. Trevor, either incredibly stupid or incredibly arrogant, chose that moment to assert his dominance. "Patrick, look, this is awkward for everyone. Maybe you should stay in a hotel tonight. Give us all time to process this situation like adults." The suggestion that Patrick should leave his own home might have been the final straw for another man. But Patrick Hardy had built his fortune by thinking strategically, by planning his moves carefully, and by never acting on impulse when the stakes were high. He looked at Trevor for a long moment, memorizing every detail of the man's face. "You're right," Patrick said finally. "This is very awkward." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving 3 very confused people behind him. In the master bedroom, his bedroom, Patrick found evidence of Trevor's extended stay. Men's clothing in the closet, toiletries in the bathroom, even family photos turned face down on the nightstands. The violation was complete and systematic. They hadn't just betrayed him, they'd erased him. Patrick packed a small bag while his mind raced through possibilities. He could confront them with violence. He was certainly capable of it. He could call his lawyers immediately and begin divorce proceedings. He could throw them all out of his house tonight. But none of those options satisfied the cold fury building inside him. As he prepared to leave, Patrick's eyes fell on the jewelry box containing Chris's surprise necklace. He opened it and looked at the diamonds that had cost him more than most people earned in a year. Then he closed the box and placed it carefully in his bag. Someday, he might find a use for it. Before leaving, Patrick made one stop in his home office. He had important documents to secure, bank accounts to protect, and plans to make. His family thought they'd won by choosing honesty over deception. They had no idea they'd just declared war on a man who'd never lost a fight that mattered. As Patrick drove away from his mansion for what he suspected might be the last time, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years: absolute clarity. The foundation of his life had crumbled, but foundations could be rebuilt. And sometimes, before you could build something new, you had to completely demolish what came before. Behind him, in the house that was no longer his home, 3 people celebrated what they thought was their victory. They had no idea that Patrick Hardy had just transformed from a devoted husband and father into something far more dangerous: a man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from their destruction. Chapter 4: The Awakening. Patrick checked into the Ritz-Carlton downtown, though sleep was impossible. He spent the night in the hotel's business center, using secure internet connections to begin what would become the most important project of his life. By dawn, he had a clear picture of his enemy's vulnerabilities and the beginnings of a plan that would make his business competitors' downfalls look merciful in comparison. His first discovery was that Trevor Garrison's background was even more sordid than Patrick had imagined. The man wasn't just a predatory personal trainer. He was a professional con artist with a string of wealthy victims across multiple states. Trevor's real name was Trevor Garrison Michaels, and he'd been married 4 times, each marriage ending with substantial settlements that funded his lifestyle. He'd been sued twice for fraud and once for extortion, though charges had been dropped when his victims chose to pay him off rather than endure public humiliation. But Trevor had made a critical error in choosing the Hardy family as his latest target. Unlike his previous victims, lonely widows and neglected wives with inherited wealth, Patrick Hardy was a self-made man who understood power, leverage, and the art of war. The second revelation was even more devastating. Amy had been aware of her mother's affair for months and had actively participated in concealing it. Patrick found text messages on a family phone plan that revealed the depth of his daughter's betrayal. She hadn't just known about the affair. She'd helped orchestrate it, providing alibis, covering for unexplained absences, and even warning Chris when Patrick's business trips were delayed. One particular message thread between Amy and her friend Jessica revealed the true extent of the conspiracy. Amy, Dad's suspicious about Mom's new workout schedule. Think I should distract him with my college drama again. Jessica, your mom's trainer is so hot though. Can't blame her for wanting some excitement. Amy, Trevor's actually really cool. He gets that Dad is basically an absent workaholic. Mom deserves better. Jessica, are you seriously supporting your mom's affair? Amy, I'm supporting my mom's happiness. Dad will figure it out eventually, and honestly, maybe it's for the best. Reading those messages, Patrick felt something inside him die completely. The last vestiges of his old life. The loving father, the devoted husband, the man who believed in forgiveness and second chances, simply ceased to exist. By 6 a.m., Patrick had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Trevor Garrison Michaels. Financial records, criminal history, immigration status. Trevor was actually Canadian, living in the U.S. on an expired visa, previous victims, and most importantly, current vulnerabilities. Trevor owed substantial debts to some very unforgiving people, had outstanding warrants in 2 states, and was currently being investigated by the IRS for tax evasion. But Patrick's most valuable discovery came from Trevor's own arrogance. The man had been documenting his conquest of the Hardy family on social media and private forums dedicated to lifestyle coaching, a euphemism for wealthy women seduction. Trevor had shared intimate details about Chris's vulnerabilities, Patrick's business secrets, and even Amy's emotional manipulation. He'd essentially created a detailed confession of his crimes, thinking himself untouchable. Chris's betrayal ran deeper than adultery. Patrick discovered that she'd been accessing his business accounts, sharing confidential information about upcoming deals, and even attempting to transfer funds to accounts Trevor had helped her establish. What she didn't realize was that Patrick had always maintained hidden safeguards on their shared finances. Every transaction was monitored, every unusual activity flagged. He'd been protecting their money from external threats, while his wife plotted to steal it from within. At 7 a.m., Patrick's phone rang. It was Chris, her voice a mixture of fake concern and barely concealed irritation. Patrick, where are you? We need to talk about this situation rationally. I'm exactly where I need to be, Patrick replied calmly. How are you feeling about your father's death, Chris? I know how close you two were. The question caught her off guard. She'd been preparing for accusations about the affair, not reminders of her father's death. That's not fair, Patrick. You know I'm grieving. Are you? Because last night, you seemed to be celebrating something entirely different. There was a long pause. When Chris spoke again, her voice had changed. The pretense of the wounded wife was gone, replaced by cold calculation. Patrick, I want a divorce. Trevor and I are in love, and this marriage has been over for years. We can do this amicably, or we can make it ugly. Your choice. Amicably, Patrick repeated. After 20 years of marriage, you think there's an amicable way to dissolve our life together for your personal trainer? He's not just a personal trainer, and you know it. Trevor understands me in ways you never have. He makes me feel alive. I'm sure he does. Where's Amy? Amy supports our decision. She's old enough to understand that people grow apart, that marriage isn't a prison sentence. Patrick closed his eyes, feeling the last door to reconciliation slam shut. I see. And has Amy chosen which parent she wants to live with during this transition? She wants to stay with me. With us. Patrick, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, Patrick interrupted. More perfectly than you can imagine. After ending the call, Patrick made his first tactical move. He called his head of security, Malcolm Dunham, a former Marine who'd worked for Hardy Foundations for 8 years. Malcolm had always been more than an employee. He was one of the few people Patrick trusted completely. Malcolm, I need you to meet me at the downtown office. And Malcolm, we're going to war. Malcolm Dunham had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining Patrick's company. He understood warfare, both foreign and domestic. When Patrick explained the situation, Malcolm's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened with military precision. "What do you need, boss?" "I need Trevor Garrison to disappear from my family's life. Permanently. But I need it to be his choice, not our coercion. Can you make that happen?" Malcolm smiled for the first time in their conversation. "Trevor Garrison, or Trevor Garrison Michaels, because I've already run a preliminary background check, and this guy has more problems than he realizes." "You've already investigated him?" "Boss, the moment a strange man starts spending time around your family, I investigate. It's what you pay me for. This particular guy, let's just say he's borrowed money from some very unfriendly people in Las Vegas." Patrick felt a cold satisfaction. How unfriendly? The kind who break legs first and ask questions later. Apparently, Trevor convinced some mob-connected loan sharks to invest in his fitness empire about 6 months ago. He was supposed to open a chain of high-end gyms. Instead, he used the money to fund his lifestyle and his pursuit of your wife. How much does he owe? $800,000 plus interest. They've been looking for him for 3 weeks. Patrick was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Malcolm, what would happen if these people discovered Trevor's current location?" "They'd collect their debt, one way or another. And if Trevor suddenly came into a large amount of cash, say, through a divorce settlement, would that solve his problems?" Malcolm shook his head. "These aren't the kind of people who forget being played for fools. Money might buy him time, but they'd want their pound of flesh too." Patrick smiled for the first time since discovering the affair. "Then we need to make sure Trevor never gets the chance to run with any divorce settlement money." As Patrick and Malcolm planned Trevor's downfall, they had no idea that their conversation was being recorded. Amy Hardy, guilty about her betrayal but still loyal to her mother, had placed a listening device in Patrick's office days before his return from Oregon. Trevor had convinced her it was necessary to protect Chris from Patrick's potential violence. The recording would prove to be a critical mistake, not because it would save Trevor and Chris, but because it would give Patrick the final piece of evidence he needed to justify what was coming next. His own daughter had chosen to spy on him for his enemies. There would be no mercy, no forgiveness, and no second chances. The war for the Hardy family's soul was about to begin, and Patrick Hardy intended to be the only survivor. Chapter 5. Gathering Intelligence. Amy Hardy sat in her BMW outside a coffee shop in downtown Denver, her hands shaking as she replayed the recording she'd made of her father's conversation with Malcolm. Trevor had convinced her that Patrick might become violent when confronted with the affair, that recording his private conversations was necessary to protect her mother. But what she'd heard terrified her. Her father, the man who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd attended every school play and soccer game, who'd patiently helped her with homework, had spoken about making Trevor disappear with the cold detachment of a stranger. The Patrick Hardy on that recording wasn't the devoted father she remembered, but something far more dangerous. Amy's first instinct was to warn Trevor and her mother immediately, but as she sat in her car, conflicted emotions warred within her. Despite everything, Patrick was still her father. The man on the recording might be capable of terrible things, but he was also the man who'd built an empire to provide for his family, who'd spent 2 weeks caring for a dying man he barely tolerated out of duty and love. For the first time since the affair began, Amy allowed herself to truly consider what they'd done to Patrick. She'd been so caught up in Trevor's manipulations and her mother's excitement that she'd never fully grasped the magnitude of their betrayal. They hadn't just broken Patrick's heart, they'd systematically destroyed his entire world while he was caring for his dying father-in-law. But Amy's moment of moral clarity was interrupted by Trevor's arrival at the coffee shop. He slid into the passenger seat of her car, his usual charming smile immediately fading when he saw her expression. "What's wrong, sweetheart? You look like you've seen a ghost." Amy handed him the recording device with trembling fingers. "I think we're in trouble, Trevor. Real trouble." As Trevor listened to the recording, his face underwent a dramatic transformation. The confident predator who'd seduced mother and daughter alike was replaced by a man who understood that he'd seriously underestimated his opponent. Patrick Hardy wasn't the absent, workaholic husband Trevor had expected. He was a strategic thinker with dangerous resources and apparently no moral limitations when it came to protecting what was his. "This is bad," Trevor muttered, his mind racing through possible escape routes. "This is very bad. What are we going to do?" Amy asked, her voice small and frightened. Trevor's survival instincts kicked in immediately. His first thought was self-preservation, not protecting the family he'd helped destroy. "We need to accelerate our timeline. Your mother needs to file for divorce immediately, before your father can hide assets or worse." "Worse? Trevor, what does that mean?" Trevor looked at Amy, really looked at her for the first time, and saw not a sophisticated co-conspirator, but a frightened teenager who was in way over her head. His manipulation of her had been so complete that she'd never considered the real-world consequences of her actions. Now reality was crashing down around all of them. "Amy, listen to me carefully. Your father is angrier than we anticipated. We need to be smart about this, move quickly, and most importantly, we need to stick together. Can you do that?" Amy nodded, though her faith in Trevor was beginning to crack. "Should we call the police? If Dad's planning to hurt you?" "No." Trevor's response was immediate and sharp. "We can't involve law enforcement. It would complicate everything." What he didn't tell Amy was that the last thing he needed was police attention given his outstanding warrants and visa issues. Meanwhile, at Hardy Foundation's headquarters, Patrick was orchestrating a masterpiece of strategic warfare. He'd assembled a team of specialists, private investigators, forensic accountants, cybersecurity experts, and attorneys, each sworn to absolute secrecy. To the outside world, Patrick appeared to be handling his father-in-law's death and dealing with family matters. In reality, he was building a case that would systematically destroy his enemies. His first target was Trevor's financial vulnerability. Patrick's investigators had located Trevor's creditors in Las Vegas. Specifically, a group led by a man named Vinny Torino, whose loan sharking operation was legendary for its efficiency and brutality. Patrick arranged a meeting through intermediaries, presenting himself as a concerned citizen with information about a fugitive debtor. The meeting took place in a private dining room, an upscale steakhouse. Vinny Torino was exactly what Patrick expected, a man who'd built his reputation on making problems disappear permanently. But Vinny was also a businessman who respected other successful men, especially those who approached him with profitable opportunities. "So you're telling me this Trevor Michaels is hiding out in Denver, playing house with some rich man's wife?" Vinny asked, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "I'm telling you that Trevor Garrison Michaels owes you a substantial sum of money and has been living under an assumed name while seducing wealthy women to fund his lifestyle. What you do with that information is entirely your business." "I need more time," Trevor pleaded, his charming facade cracking under the pressure. "I'm in the middle of a business deal that will net me enough to pay you back with interest." "A business deal?" Vinny repeated slowly. "You mean divorcing this woman and stealing half her husband's money?" Trevor's shock at Vinny's detailed knowledge was evident. He'd assumed his activities in Denver were secret, but clearly, someone had provided very specific information about his situation. "It's not stealing," Trevor protested weakly. "Chris is entitled to her share of the marital assets." Vinny laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "You're a real piece of work, Trevor. You seduce another man's wife, destroy his family, steal his money, and call a business deal. I almost admire the audacity." One of Vinny's men stepped forward, rolling up his sleeves in a way that suggested violence was imminent. But Vinny held up a hand, stopping him. "Here's what's going to happen, Trevor. You're going to pay me what you owe, plus a penalty for making me chase you across 3 states. If this divorce settlement comes through, you'll give me everything you receive, and we'll call it even. If the settlement doesn't happen, or if you try to run again, my associates will express their disappointment in ways that will leave permanent reminders of your poor judgment. What if the settlement isn't enough to cover what I owe?" Trevor asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll learn why people in my business don't default on their obligations," Vinny replied matter-of-factly. "But I'm an optimist, Trevor. I believe this Patrick Hardy fellow is wealthy enough to cover your debts, assuming you can convince his wife to take him for everything he's worth. The message was clear. Trevor's survival depended entirely on the success of his scheme against Patrick. There was no escape route, no way to cut his losses and run. He was trapped between his criminal creditors and the man whose life he'd destroyed, with nowhere to go but forward. As Vinny's men released Trevor back into the Denver streets, he felt the full weight of his situation crushing down on him. Patrick Hardy wasn't just a cuckolded husband anymore. He was an existential threat whose mere existence stood between Trevor and a very painful death. Trevor returned to the Hardy mansion, shaken and desperate. Chris immediately noticed his agitation, the barely controlled fear in his eyes, the way he kept checking the windows and doors as if expecting an attack. "What's wrong?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Trevor had always been vague about his past, deflecting questions with charm and misdirection. "We need to accelerate everything," Trevor said, his usual confidence replaced by barely contained panic. "The divorce, the settlement, all of it. We can't wait any longer." "Trevor, you're scaring me. What happened?" For the first time since their affair began, Trevor told Chris the complete truth about his situation. The failed businesses, the criminal associates, the $800,000 he owed to people who settled debts with violence. Chris listened in growing horror as she realized that the sophisticated man she'd fallen in love with was actually a con artist running from dangerous criminals. "You used me," Chris said, the words barely above a whisper. "This whole thing, our relationship, it was all about the money." "No," Trevor protested, though his desperation made the denial unconvincing. "I love you, Chris, but I also need you. We need each other. If we can get through this divorce quickly, we can pay off my debts and start fresh together." Chris felt the foundation of her new life crumbling just as surely as her marriage had. The passionate romance that had justified destroying her family was revealed to be a calculated deception. But she was too deep into the betrayal to turn back now. Patrick would never forgive her, and her only hope for any kind of future was to see the divorce through and hope Trevor's love was at least partially genuine. "How much do you owe?" she asked quietly. "With interest and penalties?" "Almost $1 million. Chris closed her eyes, calculating their chances. Patrick's net worth was substantial, but Colorado was not a community property state. Her settlement would depend on the judge's discretion and the skill of her attorney. $1 million was achievable, but it would require taking Patrick for everything she could get. "We'll need the best divorce attorney in the state," she said finally, "and we'll need to move fast before Patrick can hide assets." What neither Chris nor Trevor realized was that their conversation was being recorded by the same surveillance system Trevor had convinced Amy to help disable weeks earlier. Patrick had never actually shut down the security system. He'd simply made it appear offline while continuing to monitor his home remotely. From his hotel room, Patrick watched his wife and her lover plan his financial destruction with the same detached interest he might observe a competitor's boardroom strategy. Their desperation was palpable, their fear was growing, and their options were narrowing exactly as he'd planned. The first phase of Patrick's revenge was complete. Trevor was trapped between criminal creditors and an impossible timeline, while Chris was finally beginning to understand the true nature of the man she'd chosen over her husband. But this was only the beginning. Patrick's phone buzzed with a text from Malcolm. "Package delivered. Target received message. Recommend proceeding to Phase 2. Patrick smiled coldly as he typed his response. "Proceed as planned. No mercy." The war for Patrick Hardy's soul was entering its most brutal phase, and his enemies were about to learn that the man they betrayed was far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. Amy Hardy paced frantically around her bedroom, her phone pressed to her ear as she left her fourth voicemail for her father. Trevor's revelation about his criminal debts and the violent men hunting him had shattered her last illusions about the affair. What she thought was a romantic rebellion against her father's authority was actually a criminal conspiracy that could destroy their entire family. "Dad, please call me back," she whispered into the phone. "I know you hate me right now, but we need to talk. There are things you don't know about Trevor, dangerous things. Please, I'm scared." But Patrick wasn't taking Amy's calls. He was 3 blocks away from his own home, sitting in Malcolm's surveillance van, watching his daughter's breakdown through hidden cameras while feeling absolutely nothing. The caring father who might have rushed to comfort his frightened child was gone, replaced by a strategist who viewed Amy's panic as confirmation that his plan was working perfectly. "She's finally starting to understand," Malcolm observed, watching Amy through the monitors. "The kid's scared out of her mind." "She should be," Patrick replied coldly. "She made her choice when she decided to spy on me for my enemies. Actions have consequences." Malcolm had known Patrick for 8 years, but he'd never seen this version of the man. Calculating, ruthless, completely devoid of the warmth that had once made him such an effective leader. "Boss, she's still your daughter." Patrick's expression didn't change. "No, my daughter died the moment she chose to betray me for Trevor Garrison. The girl in that house is just another enemy who happens to share my DNA." Vinny smiled, the expression somehow managing to be both charming and terrifying. "You know, Mr. Hardy, I like you. You're a man who understands that certain problems require certain solutions. This Trevor has cost me money and respect. Both are commodities I value highly. I'm sure you'll handle the situation appropriately," Patrick said, sliding a folder across the table. "That contains Trevor's current address, daily routine, and the locations where he's most vulnerable to approach. And what do you want in return for this information?" "I want Trevor Garrison to realize that Denver is no longer a safe place for him to conduct business. I want him to understand that his current lifestyle is unsustainable. How you convey that message is entirely up to you." Vinny studied Patrick with newfound respect. "You're not asking me to kill him. I'm asking you to collect what you're owed and ensure he understands the consequences of his choices. If Trevor chooses to leave Denver permanently to avoid further complications, that would be an unfortunate but understandable decision on his part." As Patrick drove back to his hotel, he felt a cold satisfaction. Trevor's past was about to catch up with him in the most violent way possible. It would appear to be simple criminal justice rather than Patrick's orchestrated revenge. By the time Vinny's people finished with Trevor, the man would be begging to leave Colorado, assuming he was still capable of begging. But Patrick's plans extended far beyond Trevor. He discovered that Chris had been sharing confidential information about his business deals, potentially costing him millions in competitive advantages. She'd also attempted to access trust funds established for Amy's education, money that was legally protected but vulnerable to someone with inside knowledge of account numbers and passwords. Most damaging of all, Patrick had uncovered evidence that Chris and Trevor had been planning their escape for months. They'd opened joint accounts in the Cayman Islands, researched states with favorable divorce laws, and even consulted with attorneys about maximizing Chris's settlement while minimizing her tax obligations. This wasn't a passionate affair that had gotten out of hand. It was a calculated theft disguised as romance. The final piece of Patrick's intelligence gathering came from an unexpected source: the housekeeper, Maria, whom Chris had dismissed. Maria had worked for the Hardy family for 12 years and had witnessed the affair's development firsthand. More importantly, she kept detailed records of the household's activities, including photographs and videos she'd taken to document valuable items for insurance purposes. "Mr. Patrick," Maria said during their private meeting, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to tell you, but Mrs. Chris, she made me promise to stay quiet. She said you knew about Mr. Trevor, that it was arrangement you approved." The photographs Maria provided were devastating evidence of the affair's duration and scope. They showed Trevor living in the Hardy mansion as early as 3 months ago, long before Patrick had left for Oregon. They documented Amy's participation in the deception, including images of her covering security cameras and disposing of evidence that might reveal Trevor's presence. But the most damaging evidence came from security footage Maria had secretly downloaded before being dismissed. The videos showed Chris and Trevor in Patrick's home office, accessing his computer, photographing documents, and even discussing specific business deals they planned to exploit. "They thought I was just cleaning lady who didn't understand English very well," Maria explained. "But I heard everything. They plan to take everything from you, Mr. Patrick. Your wife, She said you deserve to lose everything because you never appreciated what you had. As Patrick reviewed the evidence, he felt his transformation complete itself. The loving husband and father was gone, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Chris, Trevor, and Amy had declared war on him, and now they would learn why Patrick Hardy had never lost a fight that mattered. The first phase of his revenge was about to begin, and none of his enemies had any idea what was coming for them. Chapter 6: The First Strike. Vincent Torino's men found Trevor Garrison at 6:45 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, just as he was leaving the Hardy mansion for his usual run through the affluent Cherrywood neighborhood. The encounter was swift, professional, and absolutely terrifying for Trevor, who found himself surrounded by three very large, very serious men who knew exactly who he was and why they were there. Trevor Garrison Michaels, the lead man, said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Mr. Torino would like a word. Trevor's blood turned to ice. He'd been running from Vinny's people for months, constantly looking over his shoulder, but the wealthy Denver suburb had felt like sanctuary. The realization that his past had caught up with him in the place he felt safest was psychologically devastating. I don't know what you're talking about. Trevor tried to bluff, but his voice betrayed his terror. $873,000, plus interest, the man continued calmly. That's what you owe for the gym equipment and startup capital you borrowed 6 months ago. Mr. Torino has been very patient, but patience has its limits. The men escorted Trevor to a black SUV parked 3 blocks away, far enough from the Hardy mansion to avoid witnesses, but close enough to drive home the point that nowhere was safe. The 20-minute ride to an industrial warehouse on the outskirts of Denver was conducted in absolute silence, giving Trevor plenty of time to contemplate his rapidly deteriorating situation. Vinny Torino was waiting in the warehouse, surrounded by exercise equipment that looked suspiciously similar to what Trevor had promised to purchase with the borrowed money. The irony wasn't lost on either man. "Trevor, my friend," Vinny said, his tone conversational, but his eyes cold as winter. "I've been looking for you. Imagine my surprise when I learned you've been living in luxury with some rich man's wife instead of building the fitness empire you promised me." Trevor tried to maintain his composure, falling back on the charm that had served him so well with wealthy women. "Vinny, I can explain. The Denver market required more research than anticipated, but I'm close to securing the financing we discussed." Vinny's backhand across Trevor's face was swift and practiced, cutting off the explanation mid-sentence. "Don't insult my intelligence with more lies. I know exactly what you've been doing, where you've been living, and who you've been fucking. The question is, how are you going to pay me back?" Inside the mansion, Chris was experiencing her own crisis of faith. Trevor's criminal history and the very real threat of violence had forced her to confront the reality of what she'd done. She destroyed a 20-year marriage for a man who'd seduced her as part of a financial scheme. The sophisticated romance she'd thought she was living was actually a trashy con game, and she was just another mark. But Chris's survival instincts were stronger than her guilt. She'd burned every bridge with Patrick, and retreat was impossible. Her only option was to push forward with a divorce and hope she could extract enough money to satisfy Trevor's debts and secure some kind of future for herself. She'd already contacted Denver's most aggressive divorce attorney, Harrison Blackstone, known for his ability to extract maximum settlements from wealthy husbands. Blackstone had reviewed her case and expressed confidence that she could walk away with at least 40% of Patrick's assets, possibly more if they could prove emotional abandonment or other forms of marital misconduct. "The key is moving fast," Blackstone had advised during their consultation. "If your husband is as smart as you say, he's already taking steps to protect his assets. We need to file before he can hide everything in offshore accounts or business structures." What Chris didn't know was that Harrison Blackstone was one of Patrick's oldest friends, having served as legal counsel for Hardy Foundation since its early days. The attorney had called Patrick immediately after Chris's consultation, providing detailed information about her strategy and timeline. "She wants to file tomorrow," Blackstone had reported, claiming irreconcilable differences and seeking 50-50 asset division plus spousal support. She's also requesting immediate possession of the marital home. Perfect, Patrick had replied. File whatever paperwork she wants. Give her exactly what she's asking for. Blackstone was confused by Patrick's response. You want me to roll over? Patrick, she could take you for millions. Harrison, trust me on this. File the papers, begin discovery. Do everything exactly as if you were representing her interests instead of mine. But make sure every document, every financial disclosure, every piece of evidence she provides goes through you first. Now, as Trevor frantically made phone calls trying to negotiate an extension with Vinnie Torino's people, and Chris prepared to destroy her marriage legally, Patrick was implementing the most brilliant aspect of his revenge plan. He was going to give them exactly what they wanted, and it would destroy them completely. The divorce papers were filed on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Chris had temporary possession of the mansion. Trevor was breathing easier, believing his financial salvation was at hand, and Amy was cautiously optimistic that maybe the family could survive this crisis after all. None of them realized they were walking into the most sophisticated trap Patrick had ever constructed. The first sign of trouble came when Chris tried to access the family's primary bank accounts. Despite the divorce filing, she discovered that she no longer had access to most of their liquid assets. Patrick had moved the money, but legally, transferring funds to accounts that predated their marriage, business accounts protected by corporate structures, and investment vehicles that were technically separate from marital assets. He can't do this, Chris protested to Blackstone during an emergency meeting. We had joint accounts. I should have access. He moved the money before the filing. Blackstone explained, his expression grave. Technically, he hasn't violated any court orders because the accounts he transferred from weren't specifically protected by the temporary restraining order. So I'm broke. Not broke, but cash poor until we can force disclosure of his hidden assets. That could take months. Trevor's panic reached new heights when Chris explained their cash flow problem. Vinny's people had given him 2 weeks to produce a substantial payment, and now his only source of funds was tied up in legal proceedings that could drag on indefinitely. We need to liquidate something, Trevor insisted. Jewelry, art, something valuable we can sell quickly. But when they attempted to access Chris's jewelry collection, they discovered that most of the valuable pieces were missing. The insurance company informed them that Patrick had moved the items to a secure facility before leaving for Oregon, citing security concerns while he was away. Technically legal, completely devastating to their immediate financial needs. Amy, meanwhile, was discovering that her trust fund, money set aside for her college education, was no longer accessible. Patrick had restructured the account before leaving for Oregon, changing the terms so that distributions required both parent signatures. With the divorce proceedings ongoing, any access to Amy's education money was effectively frozen. I can't pay for college now, Amy realized, the full scope of her father's revenge beginning to dawn on her. He's cutting me off completely. The psychological pressure was taking its toll on all 3 conspirators. Trevor was jumping at shadows, expecting Vinny's men to appear at any moment. Chris was discovering that 20 years of marriage to a financial genius meant that extracting money from him would be infinitely more complex than she'd anticipated. Amy was facing the possibility that her betrayal would cost her not just her relationship with her father, but her entire future. But Patrick's masterstroke was still to come. On Friday evening, Harrison Blackstone called with devastating news. Chris, we have a problem. Patrick's filing a countersuit. For what? Fraud, embezzlement, theft of intellectual property, and conspiracy to defraud. He's claiming that you and Trevor conspired to steal business information and that you've been transferring marital assets to hidden accounts. Chris felt her world tilt off its axis. That's not true. We looked at some documents, but Chris, they have evidence. Financial records, video surveillance, recorded conversations. They're not just seeking to deny you a settlement. They're claiming you owe him money for damages to his business. The trap was complete. Instead of walking away with millions from the divorce, Chris was facing the possibility of criminal charges and financial ruin. Trevor's desperation reached a breaking point as he realized that not only would there be no divorce settlement to pay his debts, but that his association with Chris had potentially made him an accessory to crimes he didn't even know he'd committed. Amy, listening to her mother's frantic phone conversation with the attorney, finally understood that her father hadn't just been angry about the affair. He'd been systematically documenting their betrayal and building a case that would destroy them all. In his hotel room, Patrick watched the chaos unfold through his surveillance network with cold satisfaction. His enemies had wanted to destroy his life and steal his fortune. Instead, they'd walked directly into a trap that would leave them facing criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and the very real possibility of violence from Trevor's criminal associates. The war was almost over, and Patrick Hardy had won before his enemies even realized they were fighting. Chapter 8. The Destruction. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Vincent Torino himself arrived at the Hardy mansion. Unlike his previous visits through intermediaries, this was personal. Trevor's 2-week extension had expired, and no payment had materialized. Worse, word had reached Vinny that Trevor's primary asset, his access to Patrick Hardy's money, was evaporating in a storm of legal complications. Chris answered the door to find a man who radiated controlled violence despite his expensive suit and polite demeanor. Behind him stood 2 associates who looked like they'd stepped out of a nightmare. "Mrs. Hardy," Vinny said with dangerous courtesy. "I'm Vincent Torino. I believe you know why I'm here." The mention of Vinny's name drained the color from Chris's face. Trevor had described these people in terms that left no doubt about their capacity for violence. Seeing them at her door, her formerly secure sanctuary, was a psychological shock that shattered her remaining composure. "Trevor isn't here," she said, her voice barely steady. "Oh, but I think he is," Vinny replied, stepping uninvited into the foyer. Trevor has a habit of hiding behind the women he seduces. It's become something of a pattern with him. Trevor appeared at the top of the stairs, his face ashen. The confident predator who destroyed the Hardy family was gone, replaced by a terrified man who understood that his time had run out. "Vinny," Trevor said, descending the stairs with forced calm. "I told your people I needed until the end of the month." "You've had 6 months, Trevor. End of the month, end of the week, end of the conversation, it doesn't matter. The time for extensions is over." Amy emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the voices, and froze when she saw the visitors. Even at 18, she possessed enough survival instinct to recognize predators when she encountered them. "Who are these people?" she whispered to her mother. "Business associates of Trevor's," Chris replied, though her voice betrayed her terror. Vinny smiled at the exchange, enjoying the family's growing fear. "Business associates. I like that. It's much more polite than the people Trevor stole money from." "I didn't steal anything," Trevor protested weakly. "The investment didn't work out as planned, but..." Vinny's backhand sent Trevor stumbling backward into the living room. The violence was swift, casual, and absolutely shocking to Chris and Amy, who'd never witnessed anything like it in their sheltered lives. "Don't lie to me in front of your girlfriend and her daughter," Vinny said calmly, straightening his jacket. "We both know you never intended to build any gyms. You took my money to fund your lifestyle and your pursuit of married women. The only question now is how you're going to pay it back." Trevor struggled to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip. "The divorce settlement." "What divorce settlement?" Vinny interrupted. "My sources tell me you're not getting any money from this divorce. In fact, they tell me you might be facing criminal charges for fraud. Is that true, Mrs. Hardy?" Chris found herself unable to speak, nodding mutely as the full scope of their situation became clear. They weren't just facing financial ruin. They were trapped between Patrick's legal revenge and Trevor's criminal obligations. "Interesting," Vinny continued. "So Trevor has convinced you to destroy your marriage for nothing, and now he can't pay his debts. That creates a problem for everyone involved." Amy, displaying more courage than anyone expected, stepped forward. "How much money are we talking about?" Vinny studied the teenager with newfound interest. "Almost $1 million, plus interest and penalties. Your boyfriend here has expensive tastes." "He's not my boyfriend," Amy said, disgust evident in her voice. "He's my mother's mistake." The comment drew a sharp look from Chris, but Amy was past caring about her mother's feelings. The romantic rebellion that had justified her betrayal of Patrick was revealed to be a sordid criminal enterprise, and she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd lost. Smart girl, Vinny said approvingly. Unlike her mother, she can recognize a con man when she sees one. What do you want from us? Chris asked, finding her voice. I want my money. Since Trevor can't provide it, and you apparently can't provide it, we need to explore alternative arrangements. The threat was unmistakable. Vinny's people didn't just break legs. They took possession of valuable assets, including people, until debts were satisfied. There has to be something we can do, Trevor pleaded. Some arrangement. There is, Vinny replied. But you're not going to like it. At that moment, Patrick's voice cut through the tension from the foyer. Actually, there might be a solution that works for everyone. All eyes turned to see Patrick Hardy standing in the doorway of his own home, looking like a man who'd just returned from a pleasant vacation rather than someone whose family had been systematically destroyed. Vinny's expression shifted to one of professional interest. This was the man whose money Trevor had promised, the husband whose life had been destroyed by the affair. But instead of rage or desperation, Patrick radiated the calm confidence of someone who held all the cards. Mr. Hardy, Vinny said carefully, I wasn't expecting to see you here. It's my house, Patrick replied simply. And you're Vincent Torino. Your reputation precedes you. The acknowledgement of Vinny's identity sent a chill through the room. Patrick wasn't just aware of Trevor's criminal connections. He'd researched them thoroughly. I understand Trevor owes you a substantial sum, Patrick continued, walking into his own living room as if Vinny's armed associates weren't present. I also understand that recent developments have compromised his ability to pay. That's correct, Vinny replied, unsure where this conversation was heading. Patrick looked at his wife, his daughter, and the man who destroyed his family. His expression remained completely neutral, showing neither anger nor forgiveness, just cold calculation. I have a proposition, Patrick said finally, one that solves everyone's problems. Chris felt a surge of hope. Perhaps Patrick was offering to pay Trevor's debts to protect his family, choosing reconciliation over revenge. She was about to learn how completely she'd misunderstood the man she'd been married to for 20 years. I'm listening, Vinny said. Patrick smiled, the expression somehow more terrifying than Vinny's threats had been. Trevor Garrison owes you almost $1 million. My wife and her lover have been planning to steal that money from me through their divorce settlement. But what if I told you there was a way to collect your debt while ensuring that Trevor never bothers another family again? The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Patrick's words. He wasn't offering salvation. He was negotiating the terms of their destruction. Amy was the first to understand. Dad, no. Whatever you're thinking. Amy, Patrick said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority. You lost the right to call me Dad when you chose to betray me for this man. You're not my daughter anymore. You're just another person who made the wrong choice. The words hit Amy like physical blows, but Patrick's attention had already shifted back to Vinny. I'm interested in your proposition, Vinny said carefully. Patrick's smile grew wider and colder. Excellent, because I think you're going to like what I have in mind. The final phase of Patrick Hardy's revenge was about to begin, and his enemies were going to discover that sometimes the most dangerous place to be is between a man and his justice. Chapter 9. No Forgiveness. After 2 weeks of caring for my father-in-law, I came home to find the door unlocked. Inside, my daughter lay covered in blood. Barely breathing, she screamed, "Run now." Why? I asked when footsteps approached from behind. I turned around and saw. Patrick paused, looking directly at Vincent Torino, exactly what I expected to see. The confusion on everyone's faces was palpable. Patrick's words seemed disconnected from reality. Amy wasn't covered in blood. She wasn't barely breathing, and the scene he described bore no resemblance to the current situation. I'm sorry, Vinny said carefully, but I think there's been some misunderstanding. Patrick's smile was arctic. No misunderstanding, Mr. Torino. I'm simply describing what this scene will look like when the police arrive in approximately 15 minutes. The words hit the room like a physical force. Trevor went pale, Chris stumbled backward, and Amy's eyes widened in terror as she began to understand the scope of her father's final gambit. "You see," Patrick continued conversationally, "when I learned about my family's betrayal, I had to decide between forgiveness and justice. My wife chose to destroy our marriage for a con man. My daughter chose to spy on me for my enemies. And Trevor chose to steal from dangerous people and hide behind my family when his crimes caught up with him." Vinny's associates shifted nervously, hands moving toward concealed weapons, but Vinny held up a restraining hand. This conversation had taken an unexpected turn, and he wanted to understand where it was heading. "Chris," Patrick said, addressing his wife directly for the first time, "you wanted excitement, passion, a life free from the boring constraints of marriage to a workaholic. How does it feel now that you're about to get exactly what you wish for?" "Patrick, please," Chris whispered, genuine terror replacing her earlier defiance. "We can fix this. We can work it out." "Fix it." Patrick's laugh was devoid of humor. "You systematically destroyed 20 years of marriage, stole business secrets, corrupted our daughter, and conspired with a criminal to rob me blind. What exactly do you think we're going to fix?" Amy found her voice, desperation making her brave. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know I made mistakes, but I'm still your daughter. You can't just—" "I can't what?" Patrick interrupted. "I can't treat you like the enemy you chose to become. I can't hold you accountable for betraying the man who loved you more than his own life." Patrick turned to face Amy fully, and she saw something in his eyes that made her step backward. This wasn't anger or disappointment. It was the complete absence of love, as if she'd become a stranger to him. "Amy, you recorded my private conversations and shared them with the man who was destroying our family. You helped plan my financial ruin while I was caring for your dying grandfather. You celebrated my betrayal and called it justice. Did you really think there would be no consequences?" Trevor, sensing the conversation spiraling towards something catastrophic, tried to assert himself. "Patrick, let's all calm down and—" "Trevor," Patrick said without looking at him, "in about 10 minutes, you're going to be dead." The matter-of-fact statement froze everyone in place. Patrick wasn't threatening Trevor. He was stating a simple fact, as if discussing the weather. Vinny found his voice. "Mr. Hardy, I think we should clarify what's happening here." Patrick finally looked at Vinny directly. "What's happening, Mr. Torino, is that you're about to collect your debt in full, and I'm about to solve all my problems simultaneously." Patrick pulled out his phone and began playing an audio recording. Trevor's voice filled the room, discussing his plan to seduce Chris, steal Patrick's money, and disappear with his new fortune. But the recording had been edited, spliced together from multiple conversations to create a narrative where Trevor explicitly threatened to kill Patrick if the divorce settlement didn't come through. "That's not what I said," Trevor protested frantically. "That's been edited." "Has it?" Patrick asked mildly. "I'm sure the police will be very thorough in their investigation. Of course, by the time they sort out the truth, you'll already be dead, so it won't matter much to you." The pieces of Patrick's plan were coming together with terrifying clarity. He'd manipulated everyone, Vinny, Chris, Amy, even Trevor, into positions where his final revenge would appear to be simple criminal justice. "You called them," Vinny said, understanding dawning. "You called the police." "I called them 20 minutes ago," Patrick confirmed. "I reported that my wife's criminal lover had threatened my family and was holding us hostage. I mentioned that he was connected to organized crime figures from Las Vegas who were also at my home, armed and dangerous." Vinny's professional calm cracked for the first time. "You son of a bitch. You're setting us up." "I'm not setting anyone up," Patrick replied. "I'm simply allowing the natural consequences of everyone's choices to play out. Trevor chose to steal from you and hide behind my family. You chose to come to my home with armed men to collect your debt. Chris chose to betray our marriage. Amy chose to betray our family. I'm just facilitating the resolution." Amy was hyperventilating now, understanding that her father intended for all of them to suffer the consequences of their choices while he emerged as the innocent victim. "The blood," she gasped. "You said I'd be covered in blood." Patrick's expression didn't change. Mr. Torino's associates are armed and dangerous. When the police arrive to find a hostage situation, there will unfortunately be violence. Crossfire is unpredictable, Amy. Innocent people sometimes get hurt. You're insane, Chris whispered. You're willing to see your own daughter killed for revenge? My daughter died when she chose Trevor over me, Patrick replied. The girl standing here is just someone who looks like her. The sound of sirens in the distance galvanized everyone into action. Vinny's men drew their weapons. Trevor began frantically searching for an escape route, and Chris grabbed Amy's arm, pulling her toward the back of the house. There's nowhere to run, Patrick said calmly. I've made sure of that. Indeed, Patrick's planning had been meticulous. He'd disabled the mansion's back exits, blocked the garage door, and even cut the phone lines to prevent anyone from contradicting his story to the police. His enemies were trapped in a scenario where any outcome would destroy them. Vinny, realizing the scope of the trap, made the only logical choice available to him. This is over, he told his men. We're leaving. Now. But Patrick shook his head. Mr. Torino, I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, I've already told the police that you're holding my family hostage. If you leave now, you'll be fugitives from a federal kidnapping charge. If you stay, well, Patrick shrugged eloquently. The sirens were getting closer, and everyone in the room understood that the police would arrive to find exactly what Patrick had described, a domestic situation involving organized crime figures, a missing $1 million, and a family in crisis. Trevor made one last desperate play. Patrick, if you let me go, I'll disappear forever. You'll never see me again. Patrick looked at the man who destroyed his family with such complete contempt that Trevor actually stepped backward. Trevor, there's nowhere on earth you could go that would be far enough away from me. I have resources you can't imagine and patience you can't fathom. Your death today is actually mercy compared to what I was planning for you. Amy broke free from her mother and threw herself at Patrick's feet, sobbing hysterically. Please, Daddy, please. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I'll testify against them, Patrick looked down at his daughter, his former daughter, with eyes as cold as winter stone. Amy, you made your choice when you had the chance to be loyal. You chose Trevor. Now live with the consequences. The first police car pulled into the driveway as Patrick calmly walked to his front door. In 60 seconds, he would transform from the architect of destruction into the traumatized victim of a home invasion. His enemies would be left to explain their presence in his home, their criminal connections, and their conspiracy against him to law enforcement officers who'd already been briefed on Patrick's version of events. Chris, Trevor, Amy, and Vinny all understood simultaneously that Patrick Hardy had orchestrated the perfect revenge. He would emerge from this situation as the grieving husband, betrayed father, and innocent victim. They would face criminal charges, violent retribution, and very possibly death. As Patrick opened the door to greet the arriving officers, he felt a cold satisfaction that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the complete destruction of those who betrayed him. The foundation of his old life was gone, but he'd built something new on its ruins, something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Behind him, his former family faced the consequences of their choices, and Patrick Hardy felt absolutely no remorse for what he'd unleashed. In his mind, they declared war on him, and he'd simply ensured that he was the only survivor. The man who'd once believed in forgiveness and second chances was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that some betrayals deserved only one response: complete and total destruction. 3 hours later, Trevor Garrison was dead from multiple gunshot wounds sustained during what police described as a confrontation between organized crime figures and domestic terrorism suspects. Chris and Amy were in federal custody, facing charges ranging from conspiracy to domestic terrorism. Vinny Torino and his associates were fugitives wanted in connection with a kidnapping and murder. Patrick Hardy sat in his hotel room, watching the news coverage of the tragedy that had destroyed his family. The reporters described him as a victim, a man whose life had been torn apart by his wife's criminal associates and his daughter's poor judgment. He felt nothing. No grief, no guilt, no regret. Just the cold satisfaction of a man who'd faced betrayal and responded with perfect, ruthless justice. The Hardy family was finished, but Patrick Hardy had survived. And in his mind, that was exactly how it should be. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.